There we go. All right, so welcome everybody to our PSA online forum. I have just a couple of announcements before we begin. I'm actually going to go over more of our future forums than usual because we have something a little different coming up. So I want to let everybody know about that. And then of course, Jeff will take over. So, all right, let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. All right. I'll make it just a little bigger. Okay, so our next one is scheduled for April 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It's going to be hosted by Paul Lewis, and he's going to look at the year 1845, and he's got the question here for us: Poe's most immemorial year. And I always send the descriptions along with our reminders. It's in an attachment, so I'm not going to go through the description here, but I am just going to note that he's got 4 scholars, including himself, talking about the year 1845. So that's our April forum. And then in May, Richard Copley is going to host the second session of How I Got Started with Poe. So many of you had attended our first session last month. So he'll do the follow-up in May. And then this is what I wanted to point out to everybody. If you're available in June, the ALA conference was moved to July, and it's been a little bit complicated, but the PSA decided to pre-record our sessions. And so what we are going to do is actually offer our presenters a live audience through our PSA online forums. And so I have 2 different sessions scheduled. We'll record their sessions, so it'll be as if you're at the conference, only watching it here on screen. They'll give their papers, and we'll have a Q&A, and each session will last an hour and 20 minutes. So we always sponsor 2 sessions at the ALA. So the first session we'll do on Friday, June 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can see here, we'll start with Poe's Environmental Humanities session. We have 2 presenters and a respondent. And then the following Monday on June 14th at 2 p.m., we will do our second ALA session, Poe in the Wireless Classroom. And we have 4 presenters for that. So the more of you who can attend and have questions for our presenters, the better it will be. It'll be hopefully a little more, engaging for our presenters, since it's sort of lonely out there in Zoom world when you're giving your paper. So I just wanted to let you all know about that. Also, many of you know we have our annual business meeting at the ALA. So we're hoping to go ahead and select the time. We'll do it via Zoom, but we don't want to interfere with the conference sessions. So I will send out an email explaining this hopefully in a simple way, but it is sort of complicated this year, that if you are attending the ALA virtually, there's a different price for the registration fee. And we're just trying, Travis and I are trying to pin all this information down so we can send out a pretty coherent, I'll try my best to be coherent when I send out the message. So that's what's coming up here soon. All right, but for this evening, we have Jeffrey Savoye, and he's going to talk to us about Poe and revisions. And I can't believe I actually don't have your exact title in front of me. So if you want to remind us of your title, and I'll go ahead, and you should be able to share the screen now.
Okay. Well, I called it Presenting Poe's Revisions. So I have some preliminary things to say, and then I hope to show you a bunch of things from mostly through the website. So I will assume that for this particular audience, it is not necessary for me to explain that Poe made a lot of revisions, nor justify that they are important for students of his writings. I will also note right here at the beginning that much of what I will show you is still in progress, some cases aspirational and even experimental. I also apologize if much of what I'm going to say is something you already know, but necessary for me to say for the sake of context. The study of changes made to versions of a given work is called textual criticism. And this field of study really has its roots somewhat ironically in early Bible studies. I say ironic because, of course, the Bible itself is not supposed to be modified. That is, there are not supposed to be multiple versions with differences. Copying any biblical text was considered a sacred act, and the whole idea was to copy it as accurately as possible. With the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that some errors have crept into these texts over the years. Although overall, given the frequency of copying and the limitations of human ability, the fidelity of copies is actually pretty remarkable. The comparison of differences did have some utility in the realm of translations, although once St. Jerome produced the standard Latin Vulgate in 382 AD, further translations were strongly discouraged until the Protestant Reformation. In 1553, for example, Michael Servetus, for committing the heresy of translating the Bible into French, was burned alive on a pyre of his own Bibles. But once translation became an accepted field of study, comparisons between various attempts of translation was certainly inevitable. In more down-to-earth literary endeavors, the writer most responsible for textual criticism as a target of study rather than a practitioner is William Shakespeare. Several variorum editions were printed as early as the late 18th century. It is perhaps no coincidence that W.W. Gregg, one of the most notable names in modern textual criticism, was primarily a Shakespeare scholar. This makes considerable sense as no manuscripts are known for Shakespeare's works, and they survive only in the form of various printed texts, mostly done after Poe's death and with no certain authority. As I've explained in various articles, this is not the situation that we face with Poe, and assumptions based on one set of texts with one context need not necessarily apply to another set with another context. A basic concept in textual criticism essentially divides differences into two groups: substantives and accidentals. Substantives are actual verbal differences, replacement, insertion, removal, or relocations of individual words or groups of words. The removal of the opening paragraph of Life and Death when it was reprinted as the Oval Portrait is an obvious example. The scene in the library in Berenice is another. Accidentals are generally things like spelling and punctuation. The term is unfortunate, I think, because it suggests that such details do not affect meaning, which, as I hope I have shown in a short item in the last Poe review about a single comma in El Dorado, is not necessarily the case. It also suggests that such changes are made without purpose or intent, which is rarely true, although they are inherently more subject to intervention and errors in transmission of a text. We know from surviving relics like the J. Lorimer Graham copy of the 1845 Tales and the fantasy pieces that Poe frequently marked what we might consider minor elements in punctuation. It is also true that editors often meddle with punctuation. A related practice we have to remember when considering a printed text is that typesetters typically had full permission to make minor changes in punctuation, not only to impose house style, but also to improve the appearance of text, especially in prose when blocks of text were set as fully justified, where the left and right margins line up. Swapping semicolons and em dashes can help to fill or remove extraneous space on some lines, depending on how text happens to fall on a page. The nature of this problem is much more common in prose and far less common in poetry, although a typesetter might alter end-of-line punctuation if it seemed too repetitive. Another big issue here is that the type for commas often gets a little worn and can begin to look like a period by mistake in poetry. For the record, I am interested in all changes, accidentals and substantives. In part, I'm interested in all of them because they form the universe of differences in texts. Most of what we will see as I go over a quick history of variorum editions is that many choices have been made based on limitations imposed by the nature of a book or by an editor or publisher acting under assumptions about the presumed audience for that information. So I will show you some of these things. I'm going to show you as I present them on the website. If you really want to see what they look like in print, you will have to get your hands on an edition. So I will probably pop through these screens pretty quickly. So don't worry if you're not keeping up with exactly how I get where I'm going. There are many ways usually to get to places on the website. So we will start with the poems. That's really where it began for variorum editions of Poe. For Poe, the first variorum edition was done in 1895, begun in 1894, in the collected edition edited by Edmund Clarence Stedman and George Edward Woodbury, and it covered only the poems. The variorum only covered the poems. Prior to this point, Ingram and other biographers were interested in the idea of texts being printed and reprinted, but mostly just to establish the first and last printings. In their preface to the volume of poems, Stedman and Woodbury state, all variant readings have been given in the notes. The editors have thought this desirable partly because there is no such illustration in literature of the elaboration of poetry through long continued and minute verbal processes, and partly because so large a portion of the verse written by Poe perished in these processes. Their presentation lists the texts known for each work with variants listed by line number for reference, but no indication in the poem itself as to what lines have changed. We'll look at an obvious example with the Raven. So here's the poem. You'll see that they don't have any line numbers at all, and they don't really have any indication where there are variants. In my online presentation, I have added little variant tags, as you can see here and here. These allow you to link specifically to, you can go to the notes for the item this way. And also you can specifically go to a variant, and you can go from the variant back into the poem text. So that's a little neat thing that I can add to the online presentation that you can't see if you only have the print edition. So as you can see, what they do is they have broken up, they list the versions of the texts. They say which text they have chosen as their copy text. I'm assuming you can see my little my arrow in pointing. I hope that's correct. Okay. And in this case, they have divided it into stanzas, even though the stanzas are not numbered in the poem. They number the stanzas, and then they give the line within the stanza, and then they give the variants, and they give the words in italics, and then they say, you know, which versions using abbreviations. It takes a while to get used to reading the particular formatting that they've come up with, and it's a little tricky because, you know, if a word is italicized or not italicized, here they're just italicizing it all rather generically. And as we go down, it continues through the notes for other things. So here's Bridal Ballad, which is the next poem. It also has it by stanza and line within stanza. And here's the Sleeper, which is a little more complicated because it gives the variants, and then it gives a full text version of the 1831 version of Irene, which has its own variants. Again, when you look at the edition, it's a little hard to keep track of it, but because I've added the variant tags, I hope it makes it a little more obvious. So these are lines with variants, and these are the variants to the lines in the additional text that they give within the body of the notes. And some of these get very complicated indeed to follow. I'm still not sure that I'm thrilled with the way I'm presenting it, but it's probably about makes as much sense as I probably can really do. Now here's where it really gets tricky, because they've got a little section and then they give an exception variant for one version. It can be very cryptic to try to follow these things, but it goes on this way. Right now, I've only got about the first third of the note section relatively cleaned up. So at least it is mostly there. So we will move now on to the Harrison edition of 1902. In the 1902 collection edited by James Albert Harrison, this idea was taken further to include the tales, all provided as a gathering at the end of each volume. The very arm notes were prepared as a PhD dissertation by Harrison's student, Robert Armistead Stewart. For the poems, it is fairly clear that Stewart relied primarily on the Stedman and Woodbury notes. For example, the variants given To One in Paradise are presented as it appeared in the tale, The Assignation, as printed in the Ladies' Godey's book in 1834. But this version is not even listed in the bibliography for the tale itself. Clearly, Stewart knew about the poem from the variant notes in Stedman and Woodbury, and not from an original printing of Poe's story. And that is not an easy copy of Godey's to find. An important distinction in method of presentation is that Harrison lists variants by version rather than all the versions by line. So we'll take a quick look at that. See if I can go down to we'll go down to the Raven again. So here's a case where I really can't do the line linking because it's not divided by line. It's just divided by each text and then line within each text. So it would be difficult for me to put a line tag in the poem, although I could theoretically link these back to the individual poem lines. But I can't really do what I've done for the Stedman Woodbury. It just isn't a one-to-one correlation particularly. I have divided up these sections so that the notes are specific for each poem, but that's because that's the way they're listed in the table of contents in the Harrison edition. So I sort of felt like I had to break them out a little bit more. But he does the same thing for each poem. So they list the various texts, and then they give variations of a specific text with what he used as the copy text. Very hard to follow. I have only roughly proofed these. Again, they're basically giving substantives. They're not giving all the accidentals. Stedman Woodbury only really give the substantives. They don't have all the versions, so it's not nearly as comprehensive as say the Mabbitt edition or what I have on the website. So that's a little section of the for the poems in the Harrison edition. Then we have the Whitty edition of 1911. In his 1911 collection of Poe's poetry, J.H. Whitty essentially repeated the approach used earlier by Stedman and Woodbury, with the addition of several texts that were not known to earlier editors. Again, a close examination shows that Whitty began with the Stedman and Woodbury variants, modifying them to conform to his own choice of a copy text, which in some cases was different than what the earlier editors had used, and he included additional historical texts. So let's look at one of those. Again, we'll start with the Raven. So again, he doesn't give line numbers, but the references are by line number, but I have included variant tags, very much the same as the Stedman Woodbury, so that it will take you into that section specifically. One of the reasons that I know that they follow the Stedman Woodbury is that they do this thing where they have the stanza numbered and then the line within stanza, but they don't do it for all the poems. They do it for the same poems that Stedman and Woodbury do it for, and not for the ones that Stedman. So they follow this odd pattern. So it's pretty clear that he just used that material as his starting point. One of the odd little things you notice when you get into this level of detail and looking at things. So again, they go on, and these are also very complicated because they do the same thing where they give the original poem, the variants to the poem, and then they give a whole earlier text of the poem, and then there are variants to that. Again, the tags lead to this. So these are the variants to the earlier text rather than to the main body of the poem. And there are some examples that get really complicated. Lenore is very hard. Lenore is very complicated to follow. They had two versions. Then they add a stanza. Again, it is very complicated, but it is there. So then, what we might consider Whitty's rival, Killis Campbell, and they did get into quite a battle with Whitty threatening to take Campbell to court over copyright violations. In 1917, Killis Campbell notably changed the approach. First, he brought the variants out of the back of the book. So let's see, for the Raven. There we go. So he gives the text of the poem, and he adds line numbers. And then at the end of the page he gives the variants. So they're no longer in a separate section. The notes are still in a separate section. So this is all the note material that he gives. He does break up the notes also, for the most part, by line numbers. So there are the line numbers. And again, for the actual text as I present it, I added a little tag not only for the variants, I added a little tag for the notes. So you can see the lines that actually have notes and the lines that have variants. And rather than flip back and be disappointed because there's nothing there for that, there's at least something about that line, and you can just go to it directly. And if you're looking through the notes and you want to go back and look at the poem, you can just click back to get back to that again. And he did at least add line numbers, although sometimes the line numbers he gives are a little quirky, especially in Polition. One thing I will note, most people don't seem to know this, although it's usually dated as 1917, most of the editions that you will find of the Killis Campbell poems were really printed in 1926. If you look carefully at the notes, you will see references to works printed in 1925. Clearly, that is not from a 1917 edition. In the online text that I give both versions. I give the original 1917 text because I do have a first printing. And then I try to give the second edition updates with a little notation that shows when new material has been added. But most people tend to make the mistake that it's all 1917, which is not strictly true. So then we will go on to Mabbitt's poems. Mabbitt's edition of the poems. Where is the Raven? There's the Raven. So in 1969, Thomas Isle of Mabbitt went further for the poems. He followed the approach used by Campbell for the variants. And you can see that he has his poem text, and then the variants are listed after the poem text. And he also brought the notes up to accompany the main text. He presumably wanted them to be more apparent to the reader, and he was able to do so because he had a larger page format, or he chose a larger page size to allow him to do this. For the poems, Mabbitt also does not mark the lines in the text that have the variants or the notes, relying entirely on line references. Like Campbell, Mabbitt gives line numbers as part of the poem texts. But again, in my online presentation, I have added a tag for the variants and a tag for the notes, which I hope helpfully takes you right specifically to where you want to go and back again. So you can go both directions in my notes. So Harrison added the variants for the tales. They're basically the same as the poems, where they list each version and then they give all the variants by line number. And Mabbitt did the same thing, but changed the formatting for the tales. So he gives his introductory information. He lists the texts that he referenced, and then he gives what his copy text is. He gives the actual text, and then he gives the variants. In this case, this is a very substantial variant because that Poe drops the whole paragraph. So here he inserts letter codes for the variants and numbers for his notes. Again, I have made these actual links. So it takes you right down to the specific line. And it's even more helpful than in the poems, because trying to find the letter codes, if you want to go back to the text, can be very difficult. So if you link on the variant, it takes you back up to the appropriate point. And something similar for the notes. You click on the note tag, it takes you to the note, and if you click on the note line, it takes you back into the text where those are. Hopefully, things that make the reference a little easier than if you just have the book. Mabbitt did not live to complete his planned edition. Oh, I do want to make another note. So, as for the poems, when changes are so substantial that a tale is essentially a new story, the idea of variance becomes utterly impractical. Mabbitt understandably resorts to printing both texts in full. For example, he prints The Bargain Lost and Bon Bon complete. So Mabbitt did not live to complete his planned edition. We cannot be certain how he would have proceeded with the other volumes. There is not really the same issue for most of the prose beyond the fiction. There are multiple versions of Letter to B, but not really for the philosophy of composition or Mayazel's chess player or the rationale of verse. Although for the last of these, there are at least substantial manuscripts, fragments to be considered, also for marginalia. For Pym and Hans Pfaall, Burton Pollen lists the variants, but he went back to putting the variants and notes in a separate section. So he went back to putting it in a whole separate section, again, listing things, listing them by line. These are end line hyphenations, errors in copy text. If you actually go into the text itself, again, I added tags that link you to the, because it's not a separate, it's a whole separate section, that link you to the variants. And again, the variants take you back into the text. And the same thing for his notes, where you can link back and forth. But again, they're separated from the text. These, of course, are much longer tails, so it has a certain utility to it. So that is sort of the history of print versions of Variorum editions. Now, for the EAPOE website itself, for my own texts as I present them, on the website, I have a luxury that is not available for all practical purposes for a print edition. Primarily, I have the luxury of space. I also have the advantage of hyperlinks, some of which I've shown you, where the option is applicable, although being online also comes with complications, primarily limitations in control over formatting. I do not have a fixed page width. Since I have to support an unpredictable variety of viewing screens, from widescreen monitors to handheld devices, the approach I have adopted is called a liquid layout, adapting, sometimes imperfectly, to the width of the screens. And I'll show you what that really means by bringing up Angel of the Odd. So I list all of the historical texts, and I give the full versions of the texts. So this is a very wide screen, but if I minimize the screen, get rid of my, you'll notice as I make the screen narrower, the text wraps itself differently. And then eventually it gets so small, it gets rid of the sidelines, and it just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller until that's the minimum size I support, which I hope is about the width of a handheld device. That is called a liquid layout, so it is constantly adapting. A line doesn't mean anything in that format because it depends. So you can't use references that way. So taking advantage of the space, my first consideration when I started to put text on the website was, what can I do that is beyond what can be done in a book? And my primary answer was that I could present every text in every authorized version with a selection of important reprints and other texts as seemed appropriate. Presenting a full text in its historical context saves the need and effort to attempt to recreate a given text by implementing a set of variants. There's actually an edition of Poe's works where they claim that they give you all of the first printings of Poe's works. And all they really did was they took Mabbott, they applied the variants that he listed, and then they called that the first versions. They are not really the complete first versions. They don't have all the accidentals. They don't have all the minor differences. The downside of, I'm also not limited to documenting only substantives. The downside is that it does not present the revisions as revisions. That is, they are not explicitly marked as changes, merely a homogeneous part of a revised text. I am greedy. I want to satisfy both approaches to Poe's writings. So my first foray into dealing with variants online was in presenting the historical collections already noted, particularly the Mabbott Pollen volumes. As I've shown, I could not only repeat what the print volumes already offered, but I could supplement that presentation with links that go either direction, and for the poems add tags within the text so that a reader can see at a glance what lines have variants and notes without having to dig into the material itself to see what relates back to the lines. Because the text lines on a web page are inconsistent, Burton's solution of making references by page and line number within a page simply does not work online. In preparing the online version for his volumes of the Southern Larry Messenger and the Broadway Journal, I've had to resort to inserting a tag within the text to link to notes, something that I'm still working on for those editions. It's very time consuming because you have to work out all of the positions. Variants are not relevant for these particular works, but the same issue applies for the notes. The SLM volume uses facsimile text from the magazine with a letter tag assigned in the column by the relevant line. Not really having a separate column that aligns with lines, I have moved these tags to within the text by the relevant word, which I hope is actually a little bit more useful. For the Broadway Journal volumes, I adopted a similar approach, but had to invent codes so that I had something to insert that you got to use as an eye catcher and something to substantiate a link. But I also wanted to do more. I looked at John Bryant's fluid text presentation of Melville's typee. In fact, I looked at it when he was first doing it. And I found it interesting, but also almost incomprehensible. I don't know if anybody else has tried to look at it, and I don't know what it looks like right now. It seemed utterly dependent on a particular technology, one that is likely to grow dated and require a lot of revisions. What I wanted was something that met a specific set of conditions. I did not want to compromise a reading text with variants, and I did not want to compromise variants for the sake of making a readable text. The two types of text are in conflict, and there is really no way to do one proper justice without doing injustice to the other. I wanted to document all changes, accidental and substantive. One of the values I find in the accidentals is that they often assist me in tracing the sequence of a text, as a large number of matching accidentals is a pretty strong indicator of a source. A complication here is in the case of the use of single versus double quotes for the flag of our union, which is a blanket text, a blanket change that is perhaps too intrusive and too much of a distraction from real changes, and is possibly better addressed with a general statement. I've actually experimented with both approaches, and I'll show you Xing a paragraph as an example. I wanted it to be printable. A website is inherently an online-oriented presentation, but I also value the utility and durability of print copy. I do a lot of proofing of the website on paper, and I regularly hear from people who do print the pages from their website and read the material that way. As far as I remember, there's no way to print the typee fluid text presentation. It's all pop-up windows. I was largely inspired by Poe's own documented method of revision, usually favoring an already printed text and making handwritten modifications to that. Where we tend to have manuscripts as in the initial text, the Murders of the Rue Morgue, for major revisions, the domain of Arnheim, or cases where Poe seems to have been trying to hide the fact that a given work had already been printed, like the Spectacles. In fact, I began to develop my current approach when I was trying to present texts that Poe had marked in this way, such as for the J. Lorimer Graham copy of the 1845 Tales and the Raven and Other Poems, and the fantasy pieces. I initially tried to follow Mabbitt's up-down arrows, which he uses for the Murders in the Rue Morgue variants, and Ostrom's angle brackets, which we continued for the letters, for inserting or deleting text, but found both really clumsy to understand. And I can show you a vestige of this that I haven't gotten around to improving yet in the Haunted Palace. I hope I don't give anyone a seizure by bouncing around on the screen here. So here's where you try to use the angle brackets and double angle brackets to show things that were inserted and things that were removed. I just find this very non-intuitive, not easy to follow. And the more variants you have, the harder it is to deal with it. It's just very clumsy. As a result of those frustrating experiments, I wanted to be somewhat more self-documenting. The problem with symbols and letter codes is that there's no intuitive aspect to them. The reader has to constantly try to keep track of what the abstract representations mean in terms of actual texts. Several people suggested to me using colors for the various texts, but there are only so many colors that you can easily distinguish on a computer. And it has the same problem of abstraction as letter codes, plus also the most common visual element that people have is color blindness, and where you can't, it's not just red, green, it can be all kinds of things. So that's a problem with relying on colors. Some use codes like SLM for Southern Literary Messenger, BJ for Broadway Journal, or GLB for Godey's Lady Book. This approach has the advantage of being somewhat mnemonic and thus fairly easy to remember, although it gets more complicated as you move into more obscure publications like SM or PSM for Philadelphia Saturday Museum versus SC for Saturday Courier, or very short titles like Lowell's Pioneer, which I guess would just be P. I chose to use verbose tags that incorporated the date and correlated back to a list of bibliographical details. My thinking was that the year of creation was the key piece of relevant information when comparing textual changes. I will note that what I'm proposing has been evolving and will probably continue to evolve somewhat as I apply it in actual practice. I have chiefly been focusing for now on more or less head-to-head comparisons of one text to the next version. I have been using it as a tool to work out the sequence of texts and to assist in making determinations about which texts are authorized versions and which are merely reprints, which Mabbott doesn't really do a very good job of. He tends to just lump all the historical texts together as if they're of equal value. This is particularly true for the Griswold edition, where it's hard to know whether or not Griswold is a new version or if it's merely a reprint. It is interesting to note that it's also been very helpful in proofing the texts that I am comparing. Comparing texts often makes me look at the texts very differently than just reading it directly. I proof each text separately, then I compare the set of texts selected, and I have to verify every difference. I also have a WordPerfect macro which will convert the comparative text to a particular version, which I can then use automated means to compare against the individual form of the text. And for reference, I have been using Juxta for the most part to point out variants. And then I still have to go through and manually work it out. I don't always like Juxta's interpretation, what it considers a variant, what it lumps together, and what is separate. But it is very helpful, and I do use that for a lot of comparisons. It helps me with consistency, of course, but not necessarily accuracy. In the end, there is no substitute to careful manual proofing, and that takes time. So with that in mind, let us look at a couple of examples. Okay, for historical portion, we did from poems to prose. Now we're going to go the opposite way because there are special considerations for the poems. So I will start with The Man That Was Used Up. So for the on the bibliography pages at the very top, I have little links that go for, there's a bit of commentary. I don't have a lot of commentary yet. Reading reference texts, still sort of working on those. Historical texts takes you to the main bibliography where I list all of the versions. I also am listing what I consider speculative texts, where I think there was a version that is an intermediary form that just hasn't necessarily survived. I'm actually working on an article about that, so hopefully I will explain that more at another time. There's a miscellaneous text, a bibliography, where I'm trying to list things that refer to that specific work. But there's also a comparative and study texts. The difference between a comparative text and a study text is that a comparative text does compare at least two different versions, whereas a study text is a version with changes marked on it. So in this case, for example, the Fantasy Pieces is a study text because it's a printed text that Poe has made changes. He's marked changes on the pages. So this is specific to those two. I list at the beginning the texts that are represented in this. I give the code that I use. So in this case, it's 1840-01, 1842-02, what they actually are. These links take you back to the full original text for that version. And then I actually give the text. Because this was a printed text, I keep the page numbers internally. I don't do that if it's two different printed texts because the page numbers wouldn't be the same. And there's usually a note at the end that explains that. So I give the text in stream, the variants. They are always bracketed by double gulls curly brackets. And the whole block is rendered as a different color. In this case, I'm still using blue pretty consistently. So that's just meant to visually stand out. You don't need to interpret it. It doesn't mean anything. It just shows out against the regular text fairly easily. Usually when you print it, you can still see it. It's a little grayer than the regular print, even if you don't have a color printer. So in this case, this shows that in 1842, which is the second version, this was inserted. This whole little block, little motto. And then as we get into the text, it goes along. And here is in 1840, the first version, there was an M dash. And then there's a change, which is what I have for the double slashes. Then in 1842, which is the second version, it became a semicolon. And then that's the end of the block. And the same thing happened again, a little bit further on, and again a little further on. Here we have 1840-01, it had an M dash, and that simply got removed. So there's nothing for 1842, no change there at all. And that just sort of keep that pattern going on and on through it. Here's a little more substantial change. Now this may look a little bit curious because in 1842-02, the word forthwith with a comma was inserted, and a whole block, a phrase was changed. So in 1840-01, it was for the purpose of giving the scoundrel a sound thrashing. That changed in 1842 to, and gave the beggarly scoundrel such a thrashing as I make no doubt he will remember to the day of his death. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment. Well, yeah, I'll stop sharing the screen for a moment because I want to show you the actual reason I did that. That might seem a little strange. Why didn't I just put the forthwith in the 1842 text? And there is a reason for that. I don't know, can you necessarily see my screen predominantly? Hope I can.
Yeah, we can see you. Let's see if we can make out what you're holding up. Okay, we can see it. I think if you want to point something out.
So this is a facsimile of the fantasy pieces. Right here, the word forthwith is written by itself in the margin, and then he marks out the text and adds the whole sentence at the bottom of the page.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why I did it the way I did. I made a distinction because it's sort of I was trying to reflect the way that Poe was presenting the change in the original. I hope that makes at least some sense. That isn't always an issue. If it's printed texts, it just, you just go from one printed text to the next. So we will do another one of the same. So we'll do this is the Broadway Journal and Works. The Works is the Griswold Works. So this wasn't printed in the 1850 volumes. This was added in 1856. So this was added to the fourth volume. So again, this is a comparative text because it's two different printed texts. I do not give the page numbers because they're completely different in the two texts. So that would just be distracting. So 1845-01 for the Broadway Journal, 1856-02 for Works. And so there's a very slight difference in that it uses all caps in the Griswold edition, and it's upper and lowercase in the earlier text. These lines are added in the Griswold edition. And just glancing through quickly, you can sort of see most of the changes are very small and some of them are mistakes. So this is an example where there was a comma. Griswold omitted the comma, but the comma really should be there editorially. And whenever I make editorial insertions in my historical texts, I put them in double square brackets to distinguish from the text itself. I don't just mark things with sick normally because that doesn't really tell you what is wrong. So in this case, I'm telling you specifically that it should have had a comma here. So apparently the comma just got dropped by mistake. Here, very slight is another one where it's done the te a little differently and incorrectly, so I correct that. Electromagnetics, they dropped the hyphen. Debatable as to whether or not that's really an error, but it is a difference. This seems to be a typo. Arabella becomes Arabelli, which I think should be Arabella. This is a long M dash that became a shorter M dash. Again, hyphenation. So what this does gives me a very quick way of glancing at the text and making a general decision as to whether or not at the end of Broadway Journal, it gives Edgar A. Poe. They obviously don't have to do that in the Griswold edition because they're all by Poe. But it lets me look at this fairly quickly and make a decision. Are these really changes that Poe would have made and left for Griswold? Or did Griswold or his editor or typesetter do this himself? And so far, at least my decision is that this is not a special authorized set of changes, that it's just editorial. And that, in consequence, I do not list the 1846 in my authorized printings. I list it in the reprints. And my justification is because of the comparative text, my analysis in the comparative text. I will quickly show you Xing a paragraph. Xing a paragraph was first printed in the Flag of Our Union. The Flag of Our Union had a weird house style where they used single quotes instead of double quotes and vice versa. A couple of magazines did that, but Flag of Our Union did it very consistently. So that is technically a change in the Griswold printing because he went back to using the more conventional format. But as you can see, just looking at this, there are lots and lots and lots of examples that are simply single to double, single to double, single to double, single to double. By far, the lion's share of the changes here are just single to double, single to double, single to double. So many that it becomes kind of clutter. So to be nice, I also did a version which I say this is a comparative text, the same thing, Flag of Our Union works with quotation marks normalized. So in this one, I just arbitrarily said we'll pretend that Flag of Our Union used the regular presentation of single and double quotes. So now you can just look at things that are changes beyond that rather odd conventional thing. So it's a lot clearer, more obvious what are really changes and differences, not just a quirky formatting thing. There is one case where I still do them because there was an omission by mistake in the Flag of Our Union text. So, and here's another one. So I give that as an error. That's not just going from double quotes to single quotes, but that's presuming that they would have used double quotes instead. So I hope that makes sense. We'll do a couple more quick ones here. I'm tying up a lot of time, but we'll do the Murders in the Rue Morgue manuscript. I'm obviously assuming that if any of this is interesting to people, they will go back on their own and dig through things, which is why I'm going as quickly as I am. So this is a study text again for the Johnston manuscript because it is a manuscript with changes on it. So here I actually list a lot of versions codes, and that's because we see a sequence, or what we presume to be a sequence of changes to the manuscript. So there's the original manuscript, and then there are things that appear to be this is material from the original manuscript that was pasted over. If you have the 1895 facsimile of the Murders in the Rue Morgue, you can't see this because the pages simply show the surface of the manuscripts. But if you actually look at the original manuscript, which I have had the pleasure of handling, there are little flaps that join the pages together, and there is actually text under those flaps. And when they did a restoration, they made those available so you can actually lift it up and see what the text is underneath. And I have recorded all of those in this text. And then 1B, a few additional changes made to the original manuscript where it seems to be an additional change. And then a couple of other, it's a sequence of changes is basically what we're going for. And again, it gives the code and what the change is. And then just, over and over again, basically repeating that same idea. So you can see here's the whole block this is hidden under one of the flaps, for example. And it's usually repeating stuff that's already there. We haven't really necessarily lost anything, although the phrasing is sometimes a little different. I'm just going to show one more. Hans Fall. Okay, Hans Fall is an example where here I did a sequence. I said most of the ones are head-to-head. A few of them I have all. The eventual goal is to kind of merge all of them together as well as having the individual ones. So again, I'll have all the various ones. This is a case where the original is the Southern Literary Messenger, then the Duane copy of the Southern Literary Messenger where Poe made changes in pencil, most of which have been erased. They're very hard to read. And then the text as it ultimately appeared in the Tales of Grotesque and Arabesque. So because this was sort of a natural sequence of texts, I put them together in order. And here what's chiefly interesting to see then is obviously for the so 1835 1, 39 is 2, and the other is 3. So again, I have the date in them, kind of self-documented, and the sequence is kind of built into it. In this case, 1835, the first version, and in the Duane copy, it has by without using upper and lowercase caps. Again, this is an accidental, but I'm recording everything. And in 1840, in the Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, they made it a large and small cap format. So there's no change marked for this in the Duane Messenger. That's why these two are together with just a semicolon dividing them. And the actual change is delimited by the double slashes. And then this happens again, physics down here. In both the Southern Literary Messenger and the Duane Messenger, Poe had physics capitalized. He didn't mark that for change. And yet when they printed it, they took the capital off. So it is a change. It's not a substantive change, but it is a change. And again, it does that all the way through the rest of the text. And then just to really confuse you, I will show you a much more complicated set of changes. Those are fairly straightforward ones. So when you get into something like loss of breath, so the original version of the Saturday Courier and the Southern Literary Messenger. So again, I list the versions, the links to those. A lot of changes. I mean, a horrifying number if you were going to try to work all this out on your own from a list of variants. It just goes. It's just a truly. I mean, it's essentially almost rewritten. Whole sections. And in this case, it really is a whole section because he deleted a big chunk of text all the way to the end. So the advantage of having it all in a blue color is that you can see when it's a long running section like that, how long it goes on. You don't have to just kind of scan looking for the gulls. You can see where the blue changes again. Very, very difficult text to present variants for in a meaningful way. And I will show you one of the few where I've actually done the all, which is Telltale Heart. So I will be doing the individual ones, but then I did a comparative. So I have all three, the Pioneer, the Broadway Journal, and the Griswold edition. And again, where there's no difference in those two, in the Pioneer and the Broadway Journal. Those two are listed with the same, that is the text with the same date, with the date code, sorry, separated only by the semicolon. Then there's the actual change. In 1850, it says this instead. And because there are a fair number of substantive differences that really suggest the hand of the editor, in that case, the Griswold text is listed in the authorized printings as the final version. And I will try quickly to do just one or two of the couple of the poems, and then open it up for questions. So start thinking of questions. For the poems, lines do matter in a way they don't really for the prose. It's an inherent part. Stanzas and lines are an inherent part of the form. So this is the study text for the J. Lorimer Graham example, which is a pretty simple one. Again, I list the versions and their codes. So here I assign line numbers, and the line numbers include the version number. That will be more meaningful when I show you the next couple of examples. Because Poe is really mostly changing little things on the existing lines. He's not moving lines around. So he changed a comma to an M dash. He added a comma. He italicized here. Darkness becomes stillness. He capitalizes raven. An instant becomes a minute, and so on. For Lenore, which is a much harder one to do, I have the link so you don't have to scroll all the way down. Again, this is the Raven and Other Poems, and the Graham version, which we are tentatively dating as 1849 when the changes were made. Because it's a text in a printed copy, I kept the page numbers. So here we have the line numbers. This is the 1845 text. And then in 1849, Poe adds these lines. So I give these lines as 02 because they are inserted lines. And this is where it gets to be kind of tricky because the line numbers reference the specific version. So in 02, 23, and 24, 25, 26, these kind of go here. Poe changes all of these lines, so it's kind of hard to represent it very effectively. So far, at least I think this is the most readable way of doing it. But the fact that these are line 02 means that they were inserted not in the same place as they were in the original text. And then one last thing to show a complicated example of Tamerlane. So this is Alarath Tamerlane and Minor Poems and the 1831 poems, which has major differences. So again, this is an example where lines were inserted in the second version that are not in the first version, or they're at least not in this, or they've been completely moved from their original location. So that's why these are line 02, the whole block of lines that were inserted. And Poe does that here. Here is where he inserts an entire stanza adapted from The Lake. So these line numbers are relative to the poems because in the 1829 version, they're just not present at all. I couldn't figure out a more intelligible way of doing this. So this is what I've come up with sort of at the moment so far. And that goes on through the rest of the poem. Again, here's a whole stanza that got removed. So they have a line 1, text 1 reference because they're in text 1. They're not in text 2 at all. So they simply get removed. And again, that goes through the whole rest of the poem that way. So, is anyone still awake? I open. I open the floor to questions.
Yeah, so what I think we'll do, first of all, thank you so much. It's a lot to take in. I'm always glad we record these, but particularly this one, because as you mentioned, you're clicking quickly through so people can come back and revisit. And I appreciate it. I saw a couple of people, I was one of them, having to really look at my screen because it's small, and hopefully in the recording we can also, and that's just what it is, but we can make it bigger when we go back and revisit the recording, hopefully.
And ideally, you can follow the links all on your own.
Correct. Yeah. So that's why I think that'll be really important. I made a quick note in the chat. Jeffrey, I'll watch it, but I do know some of our participants tonight don't have working microphones. So if you want to put your question in the chat, that should be working now. Okay. Otherwise, feel free to open your microphone. And I'll do my best also to just watch if anyone makes like a hand raising movement, or you can use the hand raiser icon. But please, anyone who has questions for Jeff, go ahead.
Yes, Jeffrey, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Bill.
Yes, outstanding. Thank you so much. Quick question. If Poe wanted to go get a back issue of the Southern Literary Messenger so he could read it, mark it up, or have on hand, where could one obtain a back issue? Because
my assumption is that he kept them with the intention of knowing that he was going to want to reprint them.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is very complicated. I'm working on another article about the Duane Messengers. I believe the Duane Messengers, the specific items that have Poe's changes on them are because Duane bought a set of the individual volumes of the individual issues, the monthly issues, that Poe either sold to him directly or sold to a book dealer in Philadelphia, and Duane bought from the book dealer and then had them bound. So I don't think Poe borrowed those from Duane and made all the changes in them. That doesn't fit the timeline. I think those were actually examples of Poe's copies of the Messenger where he had made the changes. And the reason that they're so hard to read now is because he tried to erase them, because he was thinking about their utility as magazines. He wasn't thinking about future scholars being interested in following him.
Great, thank you so much.
Jeffrey?
Hey, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. I had lots of particular questions, but I don't think that's very appropriate. I was just wondering, two broad ones. One is, as you're working with this, do you have a sense of the Poe, how Poe worked in terms of revisions over the career? That is, are there places where you can clearly have a sense that he is terribly intent on that pattern of revision? I think partially different in terms of the fiction and the poems, and other times where he's just unable to do so, or quiescent, or not concerned.
Well, I mean, that is a long-term goal of the project. One of the things I want to do at some point is to go out and try to differentiate what is the house style of Redfield when in doing the works. What is the house style of Godey's, of Graham's, of the Tales, that sort of thing, and to try to be able to make some determination as to what was imposed by typesetters as opposed to by Poe himself. You do sometimes get a little bit of a sense. It's hard to really be sure. The most obvious thing you normally come across is, Poe starts taking some of the opium references out of some of the tales. And I don't think that's because he's embarrassed by that in any way, or that it's a personal reflection on his drug use, as some people have tried to say. I think it's a case where he thought by putting them together in a collection, it became redundant. And so he's going for variety. And so he's culling these things down with the intention of getting them printed again. And the fact that he never was able to get a printed collection kind of hides that intent a little bit. But you do see some things, and there are a couple of cases. There's a small article I'm planning to do on the assignation where I see what I think has become enshrined as Poe's text, and it's a typo. And that Poe just never noticed and corrected. So you do get a little bit of a sense of that. It is necessarily, of course, somewhat speculative. But by looking at things both individually and then as groups, you do come up with a sense of things. One of the things I've come up with, and I have it noted now in the various editions, I think I propose that there was, in addition to the fantasy pieces, which only survives as the first volume of the Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque with Poe's changes, because the second volume, we believe, was destroyed in typesetting by Griswold and putting together, because the Hans Pfaall and Metzengerstein clearly come from a marked up copy, which we don't have. And they were both in the second volume. It's not entirely coincidental, I suspect. But I propose that there was a Fantasy Pieces B, another set of pages from the Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque that Poe had. Again, that he kept these because he knew he was going to do other editions. He wanted to do other editions down the line, that he made other changes to those. Griswold had access to that material, and none of those have survived except what Griswold, how Griswold chose to print those. And I think that is what Poe sent to Duyckinck for consideration with the 1845 tales. When he says that the selection, I think he took those selections from that Fantasy Pieces B material that he was putting together. And you can see that there are differences that are in printed texts that you would think would follow the fantasy pieces, and it doesn't always. And I think that's because Poe had another set of pages, and we don't have those, except we have the final text that resulted from them, but we don't actually have the original material anymore.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question at all?
Well, of course. I'm sure you can go on for a long time. A kind of a general question about something you've written about, but at the point where you're working with Griswold, Griswold gets the trunk, and Griswold is putting together he's working with the works. Do you have a sense of being able to actually pin down, one, what was in that trunk when he finally got it, and ultimately what everything that went into the Griswold works? That is one of the things that I've always astonished at, is with Griswold, you're able to sort of pick out when he's using as copy text. Is it the Raven? It's one of the two books that Poe published in 1845. So I'll just stop at that.
Well, that's an interesting example, because that's where Griswold's typesetters accidentally, I think, add the S to mortals, for example, which is another sort of enshrined typographical thing, has no credibility in any of Poe's works. It's hard to know exactly what was in the trunk. I think the main thing that was in the trunk that we clearly know about was what's now the J. Lorimer Graham copy of the Tales and the Raven and other poems, and probably the Eureka, some of the manuscript material, perhaps. It's highly debatable as to the manuscript for Poetic Principle. Poe, that's apparently where he got his hands on that finally. There are comments in a couple of cases where Mrs. Clem, I think, says that she found this or that in Poe's trunk. Well, she didn't necessarily mean the trunk that was here in Baltimore. He had obviously other trunks of material at Fordham, and she provided a lot of his material that Poe had just kept around. So I think a lot of it just came from that. Poe certainly wasn't carrying all of his revised texts around with him on his tour of the South. I can sort of work out, as another article I'm working on, what I think were the manuscripts of poems that he was taking, that he took with him. All this stuff is necessarily going to have a huge speculative element, and you're never going to completely nail it down. And no matter what conclusion you come up with, there's no absolute way of verifying it. But the real trick seems to be that Griswold simply decided, as I said in my long article in the Poe Review, once Griswold got his hands on the stereotype plates for the tales, particularly, he just used them. He didn't do anything to those. So he didn't use Poe's changes for the Gold Bug. He didn't use Poe's changes for anything else. He did redo a couple of what he thought were the more important changes to the more important poems, because it's a smaller amount of text, the Raven being one of those. and the preface to the poems, because that wasn't a huge investment in typesetting, which is obviously the biggest effort. But he wasn't willing to go through and do that for the tales. And by and large, I don't think that Griswold inserted a lot of material in the prose fiction or the poems. I don't agree with Mabbitt's suspicion that Tucker Manatees was a Griswold insertion. I think that's probably in the manuscript that Griswold had access to from Poe's papers. It gets trickier when you get into the criticism, because Griswold was trying to get rid of what he thought was redundant, duplicated information, something that was in a review and in marginalia, for example. So there's a lot of intervention there. And the selection itself probably is somewhat self-serving, because he really wanted to emphasize the harshness of Poe's criticism, just like he omitted most of the tales of humor in his initial selection. They finally make it in the 1856 volume, which I don't think Griswold edited really. I think Redfield had somebody else put that together. So it does get to be complicated.
Thank you.
David, do you want to go ahead and follow? He put a comment in the box there about the trunk, and then Danny had a question. But David, I want to give you the opportunity to respond about the trunk.
Oh no, in my studies, I think I can successfully establish that when he landed in Richmond on that last trip, he didn't have any luggage at all. And the trunk, any trunk that would have been acquired after his death from Richmond, was something he would have gotten there on that trip. Jeff points out that he certainly had, storage and trunks. It's Fordham, and my thinking is that any manuscripts or texts of substance would have been in that baggage up there.
Okay, thank you.
I don't necessarily agree that Poe did not take a trunk with him from Fordham.
Oh no, I didn't say he did. I didn't say he didn't. He left Fordham certainly with baggage, but when he got to Richmond, he had none at all. He'd lost it all. And I pretty much nailed that down.
I'd be interested in reading that. I'm not sure I agree, but that's another discussion for another presentation.
Another presentation.
Yeah, thank you. So Jeff, Danny has a question about loss of breath when you were showing us that example, wondering about if you had any idea why that block of 26 paragraphs was deleted in 1845.
He essentially rewrote the story. I think it was this is one of the things that actually sort of goes back to Alex's question. You see a large number of very substantial changes for the earliest tales, and less of that as you go on to the more mature tales. So he's very dissatisfied, clearly, with his initial stories, and he, in some cases, just completely rewrites them. Not only gives them new titles, but he really rewrites the whole thing. So Bargain Loss becomes Bon Bon. It's a very different story. And he doesn't do as much dramatic changing like that. It's more tweaking and little things here and there. It's the most substantial things he does. Dropping the introductory paragraph to life and death, becoming the oval portrait, which I think he did mostly for space. The story doesn't make sense really without that introductory paragraph. And he's just filling up the Broadway Journal pages at that point with his own material, which is why he doesn't even want to sign them all the time. So I uses, Littleton Berry. It's Littleton Berry, I think. Isn't it Littleton Berry, David?
I feel like we all just got a test.
Littleton Berry.
Huh? It's Littleton Berry, yeah. He uses
a pseudonym, right?
Yeah, he uses the pseudonym to hide the fact that he is padding so much of the material with his own stuff.
Right.
People in the know would know, but not everyone just looking at the magazine would realize that he doesn't have a lot of contributors, because they're going to see material that has somebody else's name on it. So, yeah, so I think dramatic changes like that are because Poe was so dissatisfied with the work and he rewrote it so completely. When you get to something like The Spectacles, it's a combination of the fact that he made a big change to the text, but also I don't think he wanted to send the printed pages with changes on them to Horn, because he didn't want to emphasize, he didn't want really Horn to think about the fact that it had already been printed. He wanted Horn to misinterpret it as a new story because he was trying to get Horn to print it in England.
Okay, great. I have another question in the chat box, but I'm also trying to keep an eye in case on our windows here too. But yeah, so John has a comment and a question. He reminds all of us that people in the 19th century by necessity had to have much better memories than we do with all of the electric clutches available to us. Jeff, is it your sense that Poe, as the child of actors, had a particularly well-developed memory, enabling him at times to plot out changes to his texts without necessarily always having the original version in front of him?
I don't think Poe was like we are sometimes told Mozart was, where he composed in his head and just kind of wrote out a final draft. I doubt actually that Mozart even really did that, but I don't think Poe actually worked that way. It's a little tricky because we don't have a lot of what I would call scratch manuscripts to really judge from. The closest would be, there are a couple of draft letters where there are just huge changes being made. And Murders in the Rue Morgue has a lot of changes in that manuscript. Normally the manuscripts we have are fair copy manuscripts. Poe didn't want to make a lot of changes to them because he wanted them to be neat and clean, and he wanted them to be easily read by the typesetters. He wanted the editors to be impressed by, how nice the manuscript looked. So the manuscript of the Bells that is at the Morgan Pierpont, for example, which has corrections on it, that was the draft from which he made the fair copy. That was not the fair copy that he sent to Sartain's. That was the copy that he sent to Annie Richmond. And he didn't mind doing that because it was for personal, casual use. Didn't matter that it had little corrections on it. Whereas he wanted the fair copy to be as clean as he could make it because he didn't want the editors to see all of his changes. And I don't think he really wanted us to see all of his changes either. I doubt very much that Poe really worked his plots out as thoroughly and carefully before writing as he often suggests. I think Poe wrote with great difficulty, and it was hard work for him. And I'm kind of sorry he didn't keep any of the scratch drafts because I think they'd be fascinating to see. But that's why he keeps revising things so much after the fact, because he hasn't really made a final decision, even in the printed version.
Jeff, if we had those scratch drafts, it would be like infinity work on this website for you.
It may already exceed my lifespan, but I also, the other half of that question is I think Poe did have probably a remarkably good memory. One of the reasons he sometimes misquotes mottos and references and things like that is he was probably quoting from memory. And even though it's not perfect and precise, it's pretty good. It's impressive enough that he clearly had a very good memory most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, David echoed that same thing. Yeah. How about anyone else have a question or a comment? Jeff. I'm checking all the windows to make sure I don't miss anyone. Go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry.
Everyone else is stunned into silence.
Well, I'm always awed by how much time you have put into the website, and
Me too.
I just I assume at this point it's been years of your life if we added every minute, second, hour that you've devoted to this.
I have often said that I don't know that I would have started it if I had any idea where it would have gone. And normally when people ask me why I did the website, I just say that insanity runs in my family.
Yeah, John, you've been put in the chat, bravo. I'm sure we all echo this sentiment. We're all in your debt. Certainly, I'm constantly using this website.
I'm on the website every day, sometimes 3-4 hours at a time. And I've gotten used, and you get used to how to use it, going back and forth and everything. But it's just unbelievable how much work he's put into this thing.
And I just sort of see it as it's my private file cabinet made public. The fact that other people can get use out of it is just an added benefit and helps justify the amount of time and effort that it takes to do it.
Well,
You're getting a lot of praise, definitely earned praise in the chat. I hope you're kind of following that along there,
It's
Jeff.
always nice to hear it. I sit in my little room by myself, and you don't really know. We don't get the same hit counts that poststories.com and the Poe Museum in Richmond get, but we're not aiming for that popular an audience. It's a more serious website, more serious readers, more serious scholars, students who want to push a little beyond the obvious.
For sure.
I see references to it on eBay. People are.
Yeah, I see that. Yes.
Are cutting
Sometimes
and pasting,
sometimes credited.
from it and putting it on their eBay items. And stuff
Yeah,
like
sometimes credited and sometimes not.
that. Oh, mostly not credited, of course.
I also see frequently when I'm reading articles that I know people have used the website to look at the Mabbit text. Sometimes they copy my corrections as well as, but they don't cite the website for whatever reason.
Oh, and yeah, Renata's even mentioning, just being overseas to have this resource is so important too. So, and I don't know if you even thought about when you first started the kind of reach that the website would have.
Well, I did think that I was making material widely available that really wouldn't be in any other way. Particularly when I added things like the Poe log. When I first added that, you couldn't buy a copy of that. You couldn't auction your children off and bought a copy of the Poe log. Now, occasionally copies show up. They're usually beat up ex-library copies, but there just was no way to get your hands on that incredibly useful work. So.
And if I could also thank you during times of COVID in planning syllabi and setting up exercises for my students. It's just, go to the Baltimore Post site and look at these things and hear your questions. So thank you.
Well, that was definitely something I wanted, was so that, those of you who teach could pick unusual material that isn't really available in any one anthology. And side works, various biographies and things that really wouldn't be very practical for them to get their hands on, because I know the students don't think it exists if it's not on the internet.
Yeah, for sure.
Could I try one more just speculative question?
Yeah, go for it.
I've been working with another obsessive collector, Holt, as Richard Copley has actually met him when he was Copley's Mentis. But he has a notion, generally, when he thinks about working with Poe sources and the fact that Poe regularly embroiders his material with references. His argument is that Poe must have started early and continued a collecting copy, writing it out on a running notebook, where much of the material would have ended up, for example, the various episodes of Marginalia. Poe does not spend time in massive libraries, and thus he argues he must have a kind of a running notebook that he kept, started early and kept all the way through his career. Just curious about, have you any evidence of such a thing existing, and what you think of the notion?
There's a comment, I think, in the F.W. Thomas material that Whitty quotes, the theoretical reminiscences that are a little bit dubious. No one can really prove how authentic they are. But I think there's a reference there to somebody claiming to have had some kind of file of, at that point would have been Pinnakidia, that Poe had accumulated at the Southern Literary Messenger and sort of left behind him. I think it's very clear that Poe did not write voluminous notes in the margins of books. He didn't keep the books. One of the advantages of being a reviewer was that you got the books for free, and then after you reviewed them, you turned around and you sold those for extra cash. So you didn't want to mark them up. You wanted them to be in pristine condition. Now, how much of that material Poe really kept in notes, it's hard to say. I suspect he did quite a bit of that, but he also used up that material heavily in doing the marginalia, at which point he may or may not have kept, just like the scratch notes for, a story once he had written it. So I don't think we're ever going to stumble across a cache of pages in Poe's handwriting with all sorts of things that he's written down from various places. And to some extent, I think he did just have to rely on the fact that he had a really good memory.
Yeah, John mentioned that gets back to that question about his question about memory, because he just asked, wasn't paper pretty expensive or very expensive?
Not all paper was very expensive, and because Poe worked at magazines, he got scrap paper for free.
Oh, okay. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, you can see some of the kinds of papers that Poe uses. Of course, the little book where he lists subscribers to the magazine that's at the Pratt Library that Al Rose and I printed back in '86 or so. Pages have been removed from that, so Poe was using that for blank pages as well. But I think it's pretty clear that Poe kept a lot of spare paper from the magazines that he worked on, where there would have been tons of excess paper all over the place.
Well, Steph, we're at time almost here, so I think we're just going to go ahead and wrap up. And thank you so much for taking us through the website today. I always learn so much. And yes, we'll applaud. And I found my little, some of us know how to find our reaction key too. But thank you. And I hope to see everybody on April 15th for our next forum. It's going to be at 7 p.m. Eastern time, so same time as tonight. And again, Paul Lewis is hosting that. It's 1845, Poe's most immemorial year. And thank you, Paul, for immemorial. That's not the easiest word to say. So, but yeah.
I will make one last statement.
Yes, please.
If people have follow-up questions, you have my email from the listserv, and you have my phone number from the website. So you can just contact me if you have a question.
And we probably will. We'll probably follow up. Thank you. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great evening. Bye-bye.